Welcome to the latest session in the Learning, Equity, and Power, or LEAP series, presented by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. My name is Anand Sharma, and I'm a Senior Associate at CSSP, and I'll be your host for this session. Before we get into conversation with our three wonderful guests, I wanted to share just a little bit about CSSP and the LEAP initiative. CSSP works to achieve a racially, economically, and socially just society in which all children and families thrive. To do this, we promote policies grounded in equity, support strong and inclusive communities, and advocate with and for all children and families marginalized by public policies and institutional practices. We seek to transform ideas into action, and LEAP is our newest initiative to help us do precisely that. During this session and throughout the series, we've been highlighting and encouraging learning about what it takes to advance equity and build power in communities. And we hope that you'll join us, contribute your own experience and expertise, and think about how these lessons might help you to more powerfully advance equity in your community. Given CSSP's longstanding commitment to supporting community, policy, and systems change, we couldn't be more thrilled to continue our LEAP series with this session, Supporting and Embracing Youth Power, Lessons from the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative. CSSP has had the pleasure and the privilege of being one of TC's learning partners over the past few years, and we're excited to share some of the insights we and other learning and evaluation partners have discovered alongside TCE and its many, many partners across California. In this session, we'll get just a glimpse into the critical role youth have played in TC's Building Healthy Communities initiative. And we're very fortunate to be able to get that glimpse with help from three fantastic guests. Dr. Robert Ross, President and CEO of the California Endowment, Chris Covington, who, among many things, is a former member of TC's President's Youth Council, and Karla Ortiz, who, among many things, is a current member of TC's President's Youth Council. And without further delay, I'd like to formally introduce our first guest, Dr. Ross, President and CEO of the California Endowment. Dr. Ross, welcome to the LEAP Pad. How are you?
Thank you, Anand. Thank you so much, and appreciate CSSP and your leadership in hosting this particular session. CSSP has been an incredible learning partner and strategic partner for the California Endowment over the last decade, and we really appreciate what you guys do.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ross, and thanks for your time and insights today. First off, just wanted to ask, how are you thinking? How do you think about the role of young people in leading and driving social movements, and specifically some of the work that they played in the successes over the past 10 years of BHC?
Yeah, so Building Healthy Communities was a 10-year, 14 community campaign to improve health and well-being for communities, underserved, distressed, economically marginalized communities, with an emphasis on young people and their wellness. And so we're just putting the finishing touches on that 10-year campaign, which was very successful, and we're building the next 10 years of work from the lessons and the foundation of the last 10 years of building healthy communities. And when we kicked off the campaign, one of the things that there were a couple of things that became evident to me. One is, in the history of social justice and in the history of civil rights and racial justice movements, young people have been at the forefront. It's not a new idea or concept. I mean, people named Martin Luther King and Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and John Lewis, Marian Wright Edelman, and others were all in their early 20s, if not younger, when they began to exert their leadership on the social justice landscape in this nation. So, not a brand new idea. History tells us that young people are typically at the forefront of these movements, and it's happened in Egypt and in West Germany and East Germany and in Russia and around the globe. So that's number one. Number two, Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative, in his books and in his speeches, talks about the importance of being proximate. That if you're in the work of social justice, you need to be proximate to those that are experiencing the pain of injustice directly. And when you're in a private foundation, you have to work at that. A private foundation can be a very insular and sheltered existence because you can be so far away from the pain. And then thirdly, we're embarking on this campaign to help improve health and wellness in young people. And so as a foundation CEO, we're protected and sheltered by what we hear and what we get, right? Nobody ever wants to give you bad news when you're a CEO. And I felt like I wanted direct access to young people and their experiences, who were actually living and residing in these communities and dealing with these issues directly. And I didn't want it filtered by a lot of staff. I didn't want to be sort of managed and handled by it. I just wanted face time, space time with young people directly on some regular basis. And ended up, we started out 3 or 4 times a year, and just hear from their experiences. And it's been the most rich and profound and thought provoking thing I've ever done in my 20-year career in philanthropy. I just learned so much from these young people and continue to. That is hard to get from a memo or a report or a slide deck, right? And so we leaned into emphasizing authentic partnership with young people, and it's paid off for our foundation in many ways, strategically, morally, spiritually. It's been a great ride.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. Appreciate you giving that background on BHC and some of the origins of the President's Youth Council. I wanted to ask you one question before we bring in some of the other guests. You've spoken just now in other conversations about the moral and strategic value of authentically partnering with youth. I think folks probably get the moral aspect, but can you talk a little bit about the strategic value and maybe give folks an example of how partnering with young people differently really influenced the course of BHC?
Yeah, and I could give several examples. I'm going to pick out one because it was an issue, a strategic issue that was brought to us by young people that we had commissioned consultants to help us do environmental landscapes on strategy, on health policy, and this issue never came up with with the consultants that we retained. We heard directly from young people, actually at a meeting in Fresno. For the first time, we heard about it at a meeting in Fresno. I took my board of directors to a site visit at our building healthy community site in Fresno, and we spent an evening with young people from the community, and they wanted to give us their view of what would make a healthier community for young people in that particular Fresno site. And they told us about school discipline issues, and school suspensions and expulsions, and that young people, particularly young people of color, were being criminalized in school settings for mental health and other kind of counseling needs, and for acting out, and that was the pipeline, part of the pipeline to incarceration in these communities, is when these schools marginalize and stigmatize these young people by punishing them for behaviors that require support and engagement. And so we heard that. The board looked at me like, did you know about this? And I had to sheepishly say no, didn't know it was an issue. And we started looking at the data, and the data told us that the young people were right. There was an epidemic of expulsions and suspensions that swept the nation ever since the whole zero tolerance thing in schools and the drug epidemic and the crack cocaine epidemic. And the data were pretty powerful. The more often you were suspended, the more likely you would end up dropping out and ending up in juvenile hall. And so we listened to these young people, and then we were hearing the same stories in South LA, in Long Beach, and in Richmond, in Alameda, in Oakland. And that turned into a community youth movement, where young people and organizations gathered and collected together, and started moving a systems change and policy and activism agenda that led to policy changes across all of the 14 healthy community sites. Some bills got to the governor's desk. The governor signed most of them. And, several years later, school suspensions are down 50 to 60% in the state of California. So that one was youth framed, youth driven, youth engaged, youth led. We wrote the checks and make sure folks had support. Other foundations came on board as well. But that's an example of what happens when you give young people the license and the ability and the capacity to lead.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. I think that's a great example and really emblematic of not only sharing power, listening to young people, helping them to guide strategy, but also the very broad view that TC took in terms of what constitutes health equity and healthy communities. So appreciate you sharing that. I want to bring in our next guest, Christopher Covington, who again does many things, but is joining us to give perspective as a founding member, one of the early members of the President's Youth Council. So Chris, how are you doing?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Chris. My pronouns are they and he. I'm joining you all. I'm actually occupying native Tongva land known as Long Beach, and I'm so excited to be here in this conversation with everyone.
So Chris, would love for you to just share with folks a little bit about the early involvement that you had in BHC and as a early member in the President's Youth Council. What are some of the things that really stick out to you about the work that you all did in those early days of the PYC?
Yes. So in the early days of the PYC, I joined the PYC when I believe I was 21 years old. And at that time, I was supporting our campaigns here in Long Beach around reducing the suspensions of students. And I myself, I was pushed out of school. I acted out in school. I needed support. I was having troubles in the home. And the school, instead of offering me the support that I needed, they said, "We can't support you." And I was pushed out. And so I made it my goal to really give back to my community so that other students like myself don't have to have that same experience and can have a safety net of support and get them back onto the track of where they want to see themselves. And so coming into the PYC, I was really driven to bring youth voice and authentic youth adult partnership to the table. When I first engaged with the BHC initiative in my community, I was shown a map. It was a triangle, and it had like institutions at the top. And then like community-based organizations, elected officials, and then all the way at the bottom, it had community. And I really questioned that model in regards to the 10 outcomes. And I was like, why am I in a room with a whole bunch of people who don't look like me, who are sharing that these folks are going to invest millions of dollars in my neighborhood? Why aren't my neighbors in this space? And so when I came onto the PYC, I really made it a charge for myself to say, the work of the BHC initiative needs to look like the folks who are within the community. And I did just that. And, I was recruited into the PYC through the application process. And in the early years, it was strange because here's this multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar company foundation who is charged with supporting community. And here I am, a kid from East Long Beach, who didn't have a lot of support, but I had a lot of heart coming into the PYC to say, let's make change and let's make change happen. And we were able to do that. And one of the major lessons learned early on in the PYC was specifically that large institutions or movements take time. So we can't always get things done immediately. And something I learned from Dr. Ross is if you want to move fast, you can do that alone. But if you want to move in a collective, it takes time to do that. So with that time, we had a lot of learning lessons. We had a lot of hard conversations. And through those hard conversations, those struggles, some conflicts, amazing initiatives were able to spring from that. Just like when you work with iron and you apply the pressure, you can make it moldable and create new initiatives. So that's something that I appreciate being a part of the PYC early on.
Thanks, Chris. And just want to stick with you for a moment more. What's one thing, as you look back at your time on the PYC, what's one thing that makes you particularly proud that you and your peers were able to do?
The most proud that I would say from the PYC at my time is thought partnership. Typically, foundations create advisory boards. Cities do it, school districts do it all the time. Hey, we want to hear from you. Thank you for sharing your opinions. Goodbye. But the difference in what we were able to create in partnership with Dr. Ross and the leadership of TCE, the California Endowment, was to actually invest time, commitment, education around thought partnership. So with that, the PYC really, when we had our meetings and conversations, we would speak about what's going on in our community, but we would also bring strategic recommendations for the California Endowment. And the California Endowment listened. Some of the things were like, oh, that's a little risky for us. And it's okay to be sitting in a place of like, oh, questioning, right? But some of the things in those risks were piloted out. And so the fight for racial justice, the fight for youth power as one of the core pillars of the California Endowment was one. There's still conversations around what does youth power look like in an institution like the California Endowment and foundations across the country. And we're building on that model. And that's one of the most proudest things that I walk away from the PYC with, is that a large institution with many years of influence and power said, we're going to trust these kids from wherever they're coming from and however old they are. And we're going to lean into that discomfort. And so that's something that I'm most proud of.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Ross, did you want to get in with a comment before we bring Karla into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, an example of that, of what Chris just described, was the Youth Philanthropy Institute, which was an idea that came up early on, Chris, as you remember, about how engaging young people in how to be a philanthropist. And, my first reaction to Chris's comment was like, are you guys nuts? I have program staff. I don't need you guys to make grants. Well, a few years later, we have a Youth Philanthropy Institute, and and these young people in the PYC are recommending mini grants to grassroots organizations and grassroots leaders, 2/3 of which we had never heard of and were not on our radar screen. So that's an example of one of those crazy ideas that all of a sudden we're now doing.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. You provide the perfect segue to our final and guest for this session, Karla Ortiz, who again wears many hats, does many things, but is here in her capacity as a current member of the President's Youth Council. So Karla, welcome to the LEaP pad, and feel free to tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here alongside all of us, right? Amazing, great leaders. And I think to Chris's point also, I would almost say that Chris was able to set a foundation to what PYC is now, what PYC is, and definitely thankful for that. And we're able to pave the way to be able to do the YPI, like Dr. Ross just said. But a little bit about myself, right? Karla Ortiz. I started in the BHC work maybe when I was 16. I just turned 23, so it's been a long run, roughly 10 years doing the work. I started with doing gender-based violence work, and I went up to Sacramento and engaged in all of the BHC camps and just events that TCE was able to hold. And for me, it was an escape out of my little bubble, but also to learn more about social justice and to really pave a way to gain an education in sociology, right? Being able to obtain all the leadership skills that I now have and being able to be in the positions that I have at a very young age. And it's because of the leadership that BHC and TCE offered and was able to give to young people. I vividly remember going to Sisterhood Rising Camp, maybe the second year, and that's what sparked it all for me. It lit the fire in me. I was told by a mentor there, you are a leader. There is purpose in you. You just have to see it. Until this day, I remember those words. And that's what actively keeps me going in my role and just keeps me in these different positions and always busy. And like you mentioned, wearing a lot of different hats, right? But I think it's also important to acknowledge burnout is also very real for young people. It's not something that we oftentimes acknowledge until we're a little bit older, right? Now that I'm 23, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of tired, right? And self-care is super important. And it's something that we've tried to incorporate in a lot of our meetings in PYC and something that we're currently doing as well.
Thank you, Karla, for sharing some of the more recent reflections on the PYC. You also brought up that topic about self-care, and I do want to come back to that and the role of addressing trauma and healing, because I know all of you have spoken deeply about that. Before we get to that, though, Karla, I would love for you to share with folks what's some of the work that you have done in partnership with Dr. Ross and the foundation in the more recent phase of the PYC. I know that Dr. Ross had given you some encouragement over the years to maybe think beyond the scope of what you all normally would have done, and would love for you to just give folks a sense of what does that interaction look like, and what was some of the advice that you got in your partnership with Dr. Ross and TCE.
Yeah, I think something that Dr. Ross has always said to us, and it sticks to me till this day and even follows me to my workspaces, is think bold, right? So just think bigger and be bodacious and ambitious with our goals, right? And that's something that encouraged all of us to push out of our comfort zone. Like I mentioned before, Chris's PYC term was able to pave a way for us to begin to build authentic relationship with board members, right? Something that maybe was never going to happen, maybe something that was there was a seed, but it took a little bit of that bold thinking for us to truly get there. And we're able to now be there to have relationships with the board members and hopefully eventually get to the point where we have a young person on the board, right? Because we do believe that young people are the future, and we do need to authentically invest into them. And Chris said it, the big buzzword, right? Thought partners. And that's what we have been. And we have been able to build authentic relationship with adult partnerships and being able to educate and unlearn together, right? What adultism looks like and what does it look like to work with young people, but also learning to trust adults and trust young people, right? I think that's really hard, and that's something that oftentimes we're all scared of doing, but we have to be bold in taking those walks of faith almost, right? And trusting the process and trusting, like Chris said, if we want to do something as a collective, it takes time and we have to be patient with that, but also allowing ourselves the grace that if we mess up, it's okay, because it's a work in progress and we're always learning. It's not a mistake, but it's more like these are things that we learned from and how we can be better for the next time around.
Thank you, Karla. Dr.
Yeah,
Ross.
if I can add to that, so just an example of the trajectory. It's called the PYC, is the President's Youth Council, but in recent years, I would report in my CEO report at the board meetings. I would report on my experiences and our experiences with the PYC, and the board kind of got jealous. They were like, "Well, wait a minute, why is it your youth council? We want to meet these young people." So we began a process of engaging the PYC with the board and vice versa. And so we haven't renamed it yet, but the PYC is really now the California Endowment's Youth Council and even the board's Youth Council. So we now have kind of a mentoring partner relationship, kind of paired. The PYC and the size of the board of directors is roughly the same size. So we have kind of a one-on-one sort of partner relationship between individual PYC members and individual board members, just to, back to Chris's point, what is the thought partner? It's a relationship thing, right? So let's get past the formal board meetings and get more into relationship. The PYC has been beating on me like a drum about having PYC members or youth representatives on the board of directors, which our board is now poised to do. It's going to happen within the next couple of years. We just want to make sure we do it well and do it right. And I say that in part because we didn't want, and Chris, you were a vocal person on this point. it's just not enough to throw a young person on a board and then check the box. And in fact, you actually can end up doing more harm than good if that young person feels tokenized sort of by the experience, right? And you need supports. The second point I'll make for anyone who's out there thinking about doing this, I really underestimated the amount of trauma that these young people carry day in, day out, week in, week out. And so our PYC meetings, which are usually like about 4 weekends a year, 3 to 4 weekends a year, we have a dinner Friday evening, and then we have breakfast together on Saturday. And we ended up evolving into a session, which we continue to do to this day with our meetings. It's just open mic, and we just go around the table, and it's how you doing? Like, what's happened in your life recently that's been exciting? What's been stressful or difficult? What do you want to share? And those moments can get pretty darn emotional. There's a lot of heavy stuff that people carry. We've had young people who, a parent got deported, somebody got incarcerated, somebody went homeless. We had a young person who lost their family in a fire. A brother or a sister gets shot. Somebody gets there's a lot of stuff that these young people are sort of, they're activists, but they also have lives also, and they're carrying a lot. And you need to be responsible. We need to be responsible about making space for that and making certain that people have the kind of supports they need. I mean, so we actually pay these young people a stipend just to be mindful of their, we pay our board a stipend, so we should pay the PYC a stipend. We had a little fight over that. Remember, Chris? but just making sure that young people feel rewarded for the time that they're giving us. So there was a lot to learn in those early years, and we're doing better. But the next step is either be PYC representatives on the board or young people on the board with PYC advising us about how to do it. But we'll get there.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. I saw some nodding and some smiling. So I would love to give Karla and then Chris a chance to get in on this. And if you have any thoughts or reflections to this conversation about, the importance of creating space, acknowledging and addressing trauma that your peers, when you were serving on the, PYC, Chris, or as you're serving now, Karla, may be bringing in the need to create that space, or just your thoughts on kind of the future, what you'd like to see next in terms of youth engagement with TCE or philanthropy more broadly. So Karla, just want to give you a chance to kind of jump in on this last bit of conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really big point that Dr. Ross brought up, right? Acknowledging trauma and acknowledging that we all carry trauma. That's one of our most recent bold asks and tasks, as now that we're beginning to re-envision the next 10 years of TCE, right, is really investing into funds to support youth healing across California and looking at other initiatives that are doing this work, because it is important to acknowledge that piece. And like Dr. Ross said, a lot of us oftentimes don't have space to unpack. A lot of us are holding space for a lot of people, right, day in and day out, and that does a lot to our mental health, and it's not something that we acknowledge. Oftentimes it's very taboo within our cultures that we don't talk about mental health, we don't talk about burnout, we don't talk about the depression, anxiety that we're feeling, or just a lot of baggage that we're carrying. But PYC has been able to offer that space and those tools for folks who have never done healing work, who have never sat in circle, who have never been able to talk about what's going on at home with anybody else. And TCE and PYC is very intentional about holding those spaces and providing resources for that as well.
Thanks, Karla. Chris, would love to get your thoughts either on this conversation or just kind of your hopes as you think about partnerships between youth and TCE going forward.
Yes, it's definitely, now that I've been off of PYC for quite some time, it's music to my ears to see how the PYC and the California Endowment are progressing forward. And it's important that all foundations really take into consideration the trauma and healing component, because it still happens. In August, my cousin was murdered walking down the street. A school police officer shot and murdered a young person named Mona Rodriguez here in Long Beach on September 27th. So it's happening. And I appreciate all the work that is still going forward, because through strategy, structures, investments, the humanness kind of gets lost behind. And it's important that at the end of the day, we remember that we are in an interconnected community that needs support, and to never forget about the humanness of it and invest in that work. And so that's something that I'm really appreciative of hearing, that's continuing. And that's something that I would definitely love to have folks remember as we talk about this work.
Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to give a chance to Dr. Ross, then Karla, then Chris to share any final words of wisdom that they'd like to provide with folks. I will just say I'm taking a lot away from this, as well as my broader engagement, CSSP's broader engagement with TC, and just really appreciate the conversation today about that moral and strategic value of engaging with young people, having them not only give input, but really guide strategy. They were out there advocating, organizing, but also the corresponding intentionality, right, about providing support and not just throwing young people into the mix, and the work that it took for TCE and the work that still needs to be done to really develop that authentic kind of partnership. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. There are so many lessons, but those are some of the things I'm taking away. And Dr. Ross would love to give you a chance to share some parting words.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. I mean, for me, this engagement of young people in a meaningful way has strategic, moral, and spiritual benefit to our work. I mean, strategically, they're experiencing the pain of injustice and can bring ideas about how to address them and solve them. Morally, we're making a statement that the needs of young people have been far too ignored by the powers that be in government, and we need to do a better job of censoring their experiences. And then spiritually, it's a way of saying to these young people, many of whom have been dealing with racialized trauma and other traumatic experiences, it's a way of saying, I see you. I see you. And I hear you. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to jump up and do everything you think we're going to do. But it's important in this nation for the oppressed and the marginalized to be seen and to be valued. And it's a very important, I think, spiritual message for philanthropy to endorse and affirm.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. Karla, I'd love to give you the chance to share some parting thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely would say that young people are ready, they're hungry, and they're looking to organize. And especially in the political climate that we are in, a lot of young people are looking for space to be seen and heard. And it's important to just trust young people. They are ready. It's a matter of just giving them the space, the resources, and the trust.
Thank you. And Chris, we'll give you the final word as we close out this conversation.
Yes, definitely. Just want to reiterate something that Karla shared earlier about being bold, and to touching on the thought partnership, to lean into the uncomfortableness, take risks. It's when you get comfortable, you get complacent, and change doesn't happen in complacentness. Change happens when you get uncomfortable and there's healthy struggle. So lean into that uncomfortableness and make those investments, take those risks. Through those risks, beautiful things can happen. And so I appreciate being a part of this panel today, and I look forward to seeing folks learn from this conversation and really make those investments, those risky investments into our communities, so that all folks can see the change that they want to see in their communities.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you also to Dr. Ross and Karla for their time and their insights. I've learned so much from today's conversation and getting the chance to get to know all of you leading up to today, and just want to also acknowledge the thousands, literally thousands of people, particularly young people across California, who are a part of the stories that we just started hinting at today. So I know that's a lot of advocacy and organizing and work from Karla and Chris, but there are thousands of folks who made these stories, these lessons possible by advocating and speaking up and speaking truth to power, and really having the courage to do that. And just want to acknowledge all of their efforts as well. If you were intrigued by this conversation, if you're left wanting more, that's the point. There's a lot of resources that you can check out to learn more about lessons and insights from the California Endowment and their work over the past 10 years. So we hope that you'll check those out. There are other LEaP sessions that you can check out. And we hope that this is really giving you some food for thought and some inspiration about how you can advance learning and advance equity and build and share power in your community. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for the work that all of you are doing in your communities. And we hope to see you again soon. Take care.